Good morning, everyone. Morning. It's good to see you here. My name is Karen Marcus, for anyone who doesn't know me, and I'm your lay leader for this morning service. And we know we have a normal little script for greeting people each time we gather together. But many of you know, I want to depart from the script and just take a moment at this point in the service. I just felt moved to do this. As many of you know, Mike and I have a son and a daughter and a granddaughter that live in the Los Angeles area. And they are personally not impacted yet. They are close to one of the areas that has been put on notice to get ready and get going. So they've gone through the process of where would we go and packed a car, and they sit on the pins and needles as the winds come back up for the coming week. So I just wanted to take this moment, one, to express gratitude that they haven't been affected as yet, but also to send up prayers, positive vibes, spirit, invoke the spirit, whatever is in your heart. But I want to take just a moment before we dive into the service to think about all of those people who are experiencing such devastation in California. So let's just pause for that moment. Thank you. I think, as that point of introduction, it's what makes this community so special, that we gather together in connection as a spiritual community, bound together by love and finding that connection through the acceptance of everyone who enters into our space. And that is what makes the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Lower Bucks a community that I hope each of us values as much as I do. And the time that we spend together each Sunday morning with the music and the recorded music, when Avi's not here with us, as you can tell is an example today, but also the spoken words in all its various forms. They're there to really just feed that spiritual journey that each of us is on. So I hope you find good value in that in today's service. And thank you for being here. As you heard from Janet last week, we started a new theme for the month of January in the beginning of this year. I love this theme. It's the practice of story. The storytelling is a way to give someone an experience they haven't had yet, or maybe didn't even know was possible. We all have stories we live by that aren't fixed truths. They're just old scripts that we've been following without even realizing it. At some point, we have to understand that we don't need to carry an old story that is unbearable. We can observe the story, which is a mental exercise, feel the story, which is physical, observe the story, sorry, I've gotten mixed up, let the story go, which is emotional, then forgive the story, which is part of our spiritual journey. The author Brené Brown says that when we have the courage to walk into our story and own it, we get to write the ending, something I find very, motivating. Our job is not to deny the story, but to defy the ending, to rise strong, recognize our story, and rumble with the truth until we get to a place where we think, yes, this is what happens. This is my truth. And I will choose how the story ends. We are pleased to have the Reverend Libby Smith with us again today. Welcome, Libby. Many of us don't need to be introduced to Libby because she was a minister for us from 2007 to 2013. And now that she's retired, we're really glad and grateful that she periodically comes back to share her sermon messages with us. Her title today is Stories, Windows to Wisdom. From Aesop's Fables to the Parables of Jesus, from the teaching tales of Buddhist masters to the world of Dr. Suess. Stories from wise teachers can open our minds and hearts and give us new insights into the world around us. We'll look at some favorite examples and also explore the shadow side of the power of stories. So as I said, Avi couldn't be with us today, but he provided us with a video. So let's enjoy a musical prelude from Dawes titled A Little Bit of Everything.
Good morning, my friends. This morning, I'd like to start with a song by a band called Dawes. And they remind us that everyone has a story. With his back against the San Francisco traffic, on the bridge's side that faces towards the jail, setting out to join a certain demographic, he hoists his first leg up over the rail. A phone call's made, police cars show up quickly. Sergeant slams his passenger door. He says, "Hey son, why don't you talk through this all with me? Just tell me what you're doing it for." Oh, it's a little bit of everything. It's the mountain, it's the fog, it's the news at 6 o'clock. It's the death of my first dog. It's the angels up above me. It's the song that they don't sing. It's a little bit of everything. There's an older man who stands in a buffet line. He is smiling and he's holding out his plate. And the further he looks back into his timeline, that hard road always led him to today. Making up for when his bright future had left him. Making up for the fact his only son is gone. And letting everything out once his server asks him, "Have you figured out yet what it is you want?" I want a little bit of everything, the biscuits and the beans, whatever helps me to forget the things that brought me to my knees. So pile on those mashed potatoes and an extra chicken wing. I'm having a little bit of everything. Somewhere a girl is writing invitations to a wedding she has scheduled for the fall. Her man says, "Baby, can I make an observation? You don't seem to be having any fun at all." She said, "You just worry about your groomsmen and your shirt size. And rest assured that this is making me feel good. I think that love is so much easier than you realize. If you can give yourself to someone, then you should. 'Cause it's a little bit of everything. The way you joke, the way you wake. It's getting up for you so I can watch you when you wake. So on that day in late December, it's not some silly little ring. I'm getting a little bit of everything. Oh, it's a little bit of everything. It's the matador and the bull. It's the suggested daily dosage It's the red moon when it's full. So all these psychics and these doctors, they're all right and they're all wrong. It's like trying to make out every word when they should simply hum along. It's not some message written in the dark or some truth that no one's seen. It's a little bit of everything. It's a little bit of everything.
We don't know how he does it, except that he's just moved by the Spirit. We really, really are grateful for our Avi, whether he's here in person or not. And now I invite Mike Marcus to join me up here with the to light the chalice as I say the opening words by Reverend Sandra Pease. For the stories that long to be told and retold, for the stories that long to be imagined and reimagined, for the stories that long to be envisioned and celebrated, we kindle this chalice. May its flame bring to light different truths, different paths, and different voices, all needed to cultivate a transformative story of justice, love, and beauty. And now let's welcome the Reverend Libby Smith with a message for all ages.
Is there anyone here who doesn't know the story of the Sneetches? All right. Okay. Good. And for those of you who do, I hope the profound nature of the poetry will take you to deep places in your soul. It would be a little hard to try to show the pictures, which are astonishing, but this is a story by Dr. Suess, known in the real world as Theodore Geisel. Now, the star-bellied Sneetches had bellies with stars. You can at least get a sense of what these crazy creatures look like, right? The star-bellied Sneetches had bellies with stars. The plain-belly Sneetches had none upon theirs. Those stars weren't so big, they were really so small you might think such a thing wouldn't matter at all. But because they had stars, all the star-belly Sneetches would brag, "We're the best kind of Sneetch on the beaches." With their snoots in the air, they would sniff and they'd snort. "We'll have nothing to do with the plain-belly sort." And whenever they met some, when they were out walking, they'd hike right on past without even talking. When the star-belly children went out to play ball, could a plain belly get in the game? Not at all. You could only play if your bellies had stars, and the plain-belly children had none upon theirs. When the star-belly Sneetches had Frankfurter roasts, or picnics, or parties, or marshmallow toasts, they never invited the plain-belly Sneetches. They left them out cold, in the dark of the beaches. They kept them away, never let them come near. And that's how they treated them, year after year. Then one day, it seems, while the plain-belly Sneetches were moping and doping alone on the beaches, just sitting there wishing their bellies had stars, a stranger zipped up in the strangest of cars. "My friends," he announced in a voice clear and keen, "my name is Sylvester McMonkey McBean, and I've heard of your troubles. I've heard you're unhappy, but I can fix that. I'm the fix-it-up chappie. I've come here to help you. I have what you need, and my prices are low, and I work at great speed, and my work is 100% guaranteed." Then quickly, Sylvester McMonkey McBean put together a very peculiar machine, and he said, "You want stars like a star-belly Sneetch? My friends, you can have them for $3 each. Just pay me your money and hop right aboard." So they clambered inside. Then the big machine roared, and it clonked, and it bonked, and it jerked, and it worked, and it bopped them about. But the thing really worked. When the plain belly Sneetches popped out, they had stars. They actually did. They had stars upon theirs. Well, then they yelled at the ones who had stars at the start, "We're exactly like you. You can't tell us apart. We're all just the same now, you snooty old smarties, and now we can go to your Frankfurter parties." "Good grief," groaned the ones who had stars at the first. "We're still the best Sneetches, and they are the worst, but now how in the world will we know," they all frowned, "if which kind is what or the other way around?" Then up came McBean with a very sly wink, and he said, "Things are not quite as bad as you think. So you don't know who's who. That is perfectly true. But come with me, friends. Do you know what I'll do? I'll make you again the best Sneetches on beaches, and all it will cost you is $10 eaches." "Belly stars are no longer in style," said McBean. "What you need is a trip through my star-off machine. This wondrous contraption will take off your stars so you won't look like Sneetches who have them upon theirs." And that handy machine, working very precisely, removed all the stars from their tummies quite nicely. Then with snoots in the air they paraded about, and they opened their beaks and they let out a shout. "We know who is who, now there isn't a doubt. The best kind of Sneetches are Sneetches without." Then, of course, those with stars all got frightfully mad. To be wearing a star now was frightfully bad. Then, of course, old Sylvester McMonkey McVean invited them into his star-off machine. Then, of course, from then on, as you probably guess, things really got into a horrible mess. All the rest of that day on those wild, screaming beaches, the fix-it-up chappie kept fixing up Sneetches. Off again, on again, in again, out again. Through the machine they raced round and about, changing their stars. Every minute or two they kept paying money, they kept running through, until neither the plane nor the starbellies knew whether this one was that one, or that one was this one, or which one was what one, or what one was who. Then, when every last cent of their money was spent, the fix-it-up chappie packed up and he went. And he laughed as he drove in his car up the beach. "They never will learn. No, you can't teach a Sneetch." But McBean was quite wrong. I'm quite happy to say that the Sneetches got really quite smart on that day. The day they decided that Sneetches are Sneetches, and no kind of Sneetch is the best on the beaches. That day, all the Sneetches forgot about stars, and whether they had one or not upon theirs. A lesson for us all.
Even though we don't have any children with us today, let us sing Go Now in Peace, a cappella. I know, I'm frightened too. But we want to wish all the children of the world that peace. You want to come help me? Because you got the singing voice. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the love of God surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Thank you. And again, it may feel a little awkward because we don't have Avi here giving us a nice background music, but let's have our shared plate time. And for the month of January, our gifts are going to support the Reach Out Foundation, a safe and supporting environment for individuals with mental illness or addiction disorder or homelessness. And especially this time of year when I think you've noticed it is so very cold, they also offer a drop-off place for the Code Blue participants. So this gives the homeless a place to go during the day from Monday through Friday. So we thank you for your generosity. Again, your gifts given with love are accepted with deep gratitude. And now Reverend Libby has a reading for us.
The reading is also a story, but a much shorter story. This comes from the Buddhist tradition, and I found it in the wonderful book, Stories of the Spirit, Stories of the Heart, Parables of the Spiritual Path from Around the World, which was edited by Christina Feldman and Jack Kornfield and came out in 1991. One day, Mara, the Buddhist god of ignorance and evil, was traveling through the villages of India with his attendants. He saw a man doing walking meditation whose face was lit up in wonder. The man had just discovered something on the ground in front of him. Mara's attendants asked what that was, and Mara replied, "A piece of truth." "Doesn't this bother you when someone finds a piece of truth, O evil one?" his attendants asked. "No," Mara replied. "Right after this, they usually make a belief out of it."
Thank you, Reverend Libby. I'm looking forward to hearing you dive deeper into the Dr. Seuss message. But before we do that, let's have a musical interlude, a recorded video from Avi, from Porgy and Bess, It Ain't Necessarily So, and then immediately following that, Reverend Libby will be back with her sermon message, Stories, Windows to Wisdom.
A duo of my favorite composers, George and Ira Gershwin, wrote a song that comes from Porgy and Bess. And some stories are so old that everybody seems to know them. And there's something to learn from them, whether they actually happened or not. And that's why the Gershwins wrote this song, It Ain't Necessarily So. Feel free to sing along in the chorus or the verses if you know it. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. David was small, but oh my. David was small, but oh my. He shot Goliath, who laid down and died. David was small, but oh my. Now Jonah, he lived in a whale. Jonah, he lived in a whale. He made his home in that fish's abdomen. Jonah, he lived in a whale. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. Moses was found in a stream. Little Moses was found in a stream. He floated on water to old Pharaoh's daughter. She fished him right out of that stream. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily
only one who always feels like Avi is singing straight to me. It's like, I'll smile at something and he smiles back, I swear. It's as if it's reactive in the moment. And that song has one of the greatest rhyming lines in modern poetry. He made his home in that fish's abdomen. Just always loved that. It's right up there with the Stan Rogers line about spending a lazy day at home. The baby's in the swing-o-matic singing rock and roll. My baby's in the kitchen whipping up my favorite casserole. But I'm going off track here. If I had heard Avi's music before I started working on this sermon, we would have had a completely different sermon. And listening to that opening song, I almost just threw this out and ad-libbed in a whole different direction. And I wish I'd listened to that song at the beginning of the week and just gone somewhere else. But I didn't, so you get what you get. When I was serving the Bucksmont UU congregation in Warrington, I got a reputation there as a lover of metaphor. I was always saying, oh, that's a metaphor, and oh, you can hear that as a metaphor, and I just love finding metaphors for things. It became such a standing joke that during one of our fundraising talent shows, we did this little skit where the music director kept throwing ideas at me, and I had to turn them into metaphors on the spot. We got a lot of fun out of that over the years, but it all grew out of a very serious conviction on my part that religious language is metaphorical language, that we don't have to take the stories of faith literally in order to take them seriously. So many Unitarian Universalists, and especially during the years that I was coming of age as a UU, came to this faith when they stopped believing the stories of their past, and often felt betrayed and angry at having been asked to believe things that they now realize were not true, because it ain't necessarily so, right? And when they stopped believing the literal truth of the story, then they wanted no more of the story. They turned their back on the tradition and they looked somewhere else. That may be a familiar story for many of you. And here's where a lot of people wound up. Not a bad place to wind up, mind you. But I believe that there is sometimes great power and meaning in those old stories, and that a story can be filled with truth, even when it isn't a true story. The trouble is that with so many religious stories, we've been asked to accept them as literal truth, as factual stories, rather than as windows that give us glimpses of truth, that show us how to think about being human, that teach us things about how to live in the world. Now that's why I chose the reading that I did for this morning. For one thing, it is itself a teaching tale, which was the kind of story I wanted to lift up this morning. It wasn't ever meant to be taken as an account of some historical event where the Buddhist god of destruction and evil was walking with his attendants. It was told to help us understand something. And what it asks us to understand is the danger of taking truth, meaning moments of insight and awareness and beauty, and turning them into belief, meaning dogma or rigidity or absolutism. That's exactly what has happened with many beautiful religious stories. And I've spent a lot of my ministry trying to rescue those stories from the bonds of literalism, hence my love of metaphors. Of course, not all stories are full of wisdom and beauty. There are plenty of stories, whether we talk about fiction that we've read. I remember my sister and I comparing notes about the novels we grew up with that gave us some really not so helpful stories of what it means to be a woman and how relationships should go and the need to be rescued. I mean, think about fairy tales. And there are plenty of stories woven into the religions of the world that hurt people, that teach lessons that harm rather than heal. One of the intentions behind this month's theme of story is the invitation to look at the way we often find ourselves living within stories that limit or hurt or oppress us or others, and to invite us to rethink and reshape those stories to create healthier paradigms. And that is important work. It's life-giving, sometimes life-saving work, the work of freeing ourselves and others from oppressive stories. But this morning, I want to look at the positive side of stories, The way that stories invite us, at their best, to make sense of the world and our place in it. The way they give shape and voice to our experience and provide a framework for exploring and finding new insights. And to suggest that even some of the stories we may have rejected could hold some valuable meaning if we could look at them differently. Now, stories have been used as teaching tales for about as long as human beings have had speech. Stories have been a way that people make sense out of the world. It's a way that people have tried to explain why things are the way they are. Pretty much every tradition in the world has its own origin story, its own creation story. When I was a child in UU Sunday School, there was a curriculum called Beginnings, and it was a whole Sunday school term of looking at different creation stories from different cultures. And the story from the book of Genesis was presented as one myth among many of the ways that people tried to understand how the world had come to be. So we heard that creation story as just one of a multitude of different cultural myths about the beginning of the world. Stories have also been a way to teach about what it means to be human, how we should live. And sometimes those stories are really clear and unambiguous. I mean, think about Aesop's Fables, for example. You've probably encountered the Fables of Aesop. There will be a little story, usually the characters are animals, and at the end it says in no uncertain terms, moral, and then they tell you the moral of the story. Aesop was not messing around with any possibility that you might misunderstand his point. He spelled it right out there. Children's stories are often like that, clear and unambiguous. I love the story of the Sneetches, but there's nothing subtle about that story. There really aren't multiple ways to hear it. Dr. Seuss is not mincing words. Bear in mind the copyright. I was surprised to realize how old it was. The copyright was 1961, which was the height of the civil rights movement. I don't think that's any accident in the terms of the theme of the story, although I also read in Wikipedia that Seuss was motivated as powerfully to write against anti-Semitism as he was to write against racism. Theodor Geisel, the real name of Dr. Seuss, came from a Jewish heritage, although he was raised in the Missouri Synod Lutheran faith and remained in that faith for his entire life. But he was always a liberal Democrat who was always preaching, if you will, in his stories, this inclusiveness. Now, he's on record as saying that he never began a story with a moral in mind, saying, quote, kids can see a moral coming a mile off. But he certainly wrote about issues, and he considered himself, and I quote, subversive as hell. He believed in equality, and he knew that stories have opened more hearts and minds than any sermon or political stump speech has ever done. Now, I think everyone in this room understands that there never were actually any Sneetches, right? This is not a literal story. The Sneetches are not real. There probably was never a Sylvester McMonkey McBean. There was probably never a stars on and stars off machine. But we don't discount the wisdom in this story just because it never actually happened. We enter willingly into the story, and then we learn from the lessons that it teaches us. And many of the stories of Dr. Seuss have taken on the weight of modern cultural mythology, these archetypal stories about human nature in both its beauty and its struggles. And Horton Hears a Who is another classic example, where only the elephant can hear those tiny little voices saying, we are here, when the entire civilization is about to be snuffed out. I mean, that's not real subtle either. In the same way, I think every religious tradition that I'm familiar with anyway has a deep well of mythic stories that are used to convey wisdom, to help people understand some of the great truths of human existence. Now, the stories themselves were never intended to be heard as true stories, any more than the story of the Sneetches was ever intended to be presented as a true story. Seuss was not trying to convince anybody that there really were Sneetches. But as a colleague of mine once said in a sermon about the Christmas story, You don't have to believe the story to believe what the story is about. Now, I've said that with children's stories, the point is usually pretty obvious. But when we get into the realm of spiritual wisdom tales, things get a little more ambiguous and the listener has to do a little more work. Sometimes religious teaching tales make their point through irony or absurdity. And this is especially true of the stories about Mullah Nasruddin. These come out of the Sufi tradition, the mystical branch of Islam. And he's sort of the wise fool of Sufi legend. Mullah is a title. It's an honorific that's usually used for an imam or a religious leader, someone highly esteemed and highly learned in the community. So there's definitely some irony here because Mullah Nasruddin, as you'll hear from the one story I'll give you as an example, is not your typical learned and wise teacher. But he is certainly wise in his own foolish way. Nasruddin probably was a real person, a Turkish traveling Sufi or spiritual seeker in the 13th century. But the stories about him, and there are countless Mullah Nasruddin stories, are usually more legendary than real. Some of them may have seeds in reality, we don't really know. But they teach wisdom through foolishness, making us laugh at the foibles of Nasruddin, and then by extension perhaps to learn to recognize and laugh at our own foibles. Here's one example. Mullah Nasruddin was outside on his hands and knees below a lantern when a friend walked by. "What are you doing, Mullah?" his friend asked. "I'm looking for my key. I've lost it." So his friend got down on his hands and knees, and they both searched for a long time in the dirt beneath the lantern. Finding nothing, his friend finally turned to him and said, "Where exactly did you lose it?" Nasruddin replied, "Well, I lost it in the house, but there's more light for searching out here." So our first reaction is just to laugh at the foolish Mullah Nasruddin, wasting his time and his friend's time looking in the wrong place. But then we might find ourselves wondering, how am I like the mullah? How often do I look for satisfaction in the wrong places? How often do I fail to go to the real source of what I need to do? Our laughter at Mullah's foolishness can lead us to deeper self-awareness if we enter into the story and see ourselves there. Another one of my favorite Mullah Nasruddin stories is the one where he has planted a garden, but he can't get rid of the dandelions. And he goes to every gardening expert in the kingdom, trying to get help to get rid of these dandelions, and he tries everything and nothing works. And he finally goes to the, I don't remember exactly, the great master gardener of all time, and pours out his trouble to him. And the gardener says, "Have you tried this?" "Yes, I tried that." "Have you tried that?" "Yes, I tried that." And finally the expert looks at him and says, "Well then, I suggest you learn to love them." I think sometime I'll have a lot of fun and do a whole sermon just based on the tales of Mullah Nasruddin. I would really enjoy doing that. But this morning I want to keep moving and take a glimpse into a few other traditions as well. As many of you know, there are many, many teaching tales in Buddhism, and the Zen tradition in particular uses stories, often sort of confusing or ambiguous stories, to challenge its followers to explore more deeply, to reach enlightenment. And one of the stories that I love, this one is less ambiguous and more direct, is the story about Nan-in, who was a Japanese master during the Meijing era, 1868 to 1912. So apparently he was a real person. He received a university professor who came to inquire of him about Zen, wanted to learn. And Nan-in served tea. He poured his visitor's cup full and then kept on pouring. The professor watched the cup overflow until he could no longer restrain himself. "It is overfull, no more will go in." "Like this cup," Nan-in said, "you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" Maybe Nan-in really did have this interaction with the university professor. We don't know, but it doesn't matter. The point is the same whether or not the incident actually took place. The story asks us to look deeper into our own lives and to consider how our own ego and assumptions are getting in the way of our openness, our learning and growing. Now, Jesus was another teacher who relied on stories to make his followers think. And many of you are familiar with the parables of Jesus. The story of the Good Samaritan is one of the most famous parables that Jesus told. He would tell these sometimes rather obscure parables, and when people would say, well, what does it mean? He would just say, let them that have ears to hear, let them hear. You know, either you get it or you don't, he's saying. Now, sometimes he would he would explain it to his followers, but not to anyone else. And the idea seems to be that he was trying intentionally to leave other people outside of his immediate circle confused by the stories. But I think in a way that's a gift rather than a punishment, because if we don't immediately know what something means, we spend a lot more time trying to figure it out, and sometimes it takes us to unexpected places. Maybe where he expected them to go with it and maybe not. Now, a lot of people look at the parables and choose to interpret them just as unambiguously as they might the story of the Sneetches. They read it and they say, okay, here's what Jesus meant. I know what he meant, and it means this. But parables are often much more nuanced and open to interpretation than that. And I love, Eugene Patterson was a pastor. I didn't think to look him up again to remember exactly what tradition he's from. He wrote a lot of stuff that I found helpful, and one of them was the book, The Contemplative Pastor. And in that book, he describes parables as being like time bombs. He said, you hear them and you think, okay, I get it, and then the real meaning blows up and hits you somewhere down the road while you're still mulling it over. Jesus constantly used parables to turn things upside down, to confront his followers with challenges to their worldview, to shake up the status quo and make them look at things in a different direction. Saying things like, the last shall be first, is a really specific and literal example of turning it upside down. But here's one of my favorites. The kingdom of heaven, he said, is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is smaller than all seeds, but when it is grown, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in its branches. So that's his description of the kingdom of heaven. And I would remind you that when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, he was never talking about an afterlife. He was talking about this life as it should be if we all lived into what he understood God's plan to be fully. My Mennonite pastor refuses to say kingdom and instead says kingdom, the family, the kingdom of God. This parable appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and at first it seems very straightforward. Mustard seed, tiny little thing, but you plant it and you tend it and it gets big. So that's how faith is, right? You have a little bit of faith, but you tend to it and it gets bigger. So if we plant the seeds of the kingdom, if we sow tiny little bits of love and goodness and justice, they'll grow and everything will be good. But I wrote a whole sermon on this parable and was fascinated to learn that mustard in Jesus' time was a nuisance plant. It was invasive, it was undesirable, it was prone to taking over fields and hillsides. Jesus says in the parable the man took it and sowed it in his field, which makes it sound like he's planting it on purpose, but no one would have planted mustard seed on purpose in his time. In fact, I found one source that quoted ancient Jewish gardening practices as prohibiting the planting of mustard in garden beds because it was so invasive. So what does it mean to compare the kingdom of God to a common, invasive, and annoying weed? Suddenly the parable got a little more complicated, right? Now, if I kept going with that story, I'd be giving you that sermon, which I did years ago, but I bet none of you remember. So maybe I'll bring it back another time. But again, Jesus is not asking his followers to believe that an actual man planted an actual mustard seed. That's just not the point. The power of the story lies in the extended metaphor that he's giving them for what the kingdom of God is like, and the complexities within that metaphor, and the requirement that they enter into the story and try to figure out what it means. So you could say, okay, the kingdom of God, it's downright subversive, right? It's this grassroots thing, and once it gets sown in there, nobody's going to be able to uproot it. Or you could stick with the more simplistic, you plant a little seed, you get a big plant. Tend to the small things. Or it could be both. Now, I've said that the stories attributed to these teachers, to Mullah Nasruddin, to the Buddha, to Jesus, were never meant to be taken literally. Listeners understood that these were stories that were told to make a point, to ask them to think, to examine their lives, to gain some new insights and understandings. So now I want to take it just one step further, kind of circling back to what I was saying at the very beginning of the sermon about religious stories and our tendency to throw them away when we stop believing in them. Because we can also look at the stories that are told about these religious teachers in the same way. Again, going back to the Unitarianism of my childhood, we also had Sunday school materials that presented those miraculous stories about Jesus' birth, you know, the angels and the star and the magi and all of that, right alongside very similar miraculous stories about the births of Confucius and the Buddha. The point was that when someone has become so beloved and respected and even revered, people come up with stories about their origins that reflect that give honor to the wonderfulness of this human being. How can I express how wonderful this person made me feel? Why, there must have been angels singing when he was born. So people create miraculous beginnings to back up their sense of how special a person was. Probably a lot of the early hearers of the stories about Jesus would have heard a lot of those stories as including a lot of, shall we say, poetic license. That was very common in the storytelling of the time. People used hyperbole, they embroidered, they were making a point, just as Jesus was making a point with his parables. So they were taking a story that had some truth to it and developing it in ways that expressed emotions and understandings and reactions that may not have been based in literal truth. But for many of us, the choice has always been presented this way. Believe them as factual truth or reject them. And that has just come to make me very sad. And I don't know about you, but this year in particular, and I will say in our post-election reality, I needed stories this winter that reminded me that hope can be born in small and humble ways, like in a tiny baby, that light can break through the darkness, like a great star in the sky, that there are people who can come and show us new and better ways to be human and to treat one another. I don't have to believe the story to believe what it's about. And I know some of you have heard me preach on this theme in much greater depth in the past. This morning, I'm really just saying this as a postscript to the rest of the sermon about the power of stories. Because there are lots of good reasons to reject stories. If a story is damaging, if it's oppressive, if it's patriarchal, if it's dehumanizing. I know you've got someone coming later in the month who's going to be talking about the stories we've bought into about how we treat the earth, and how damaging some of them have been, and how we need to reject those stories and create new ones. But other stories are filled with beauty and meaning and wisdom. And while there may be many reasons to reject a story, a lack of factual truth doesn't necessarily need to be one of them. Because like the story of the Sneetches, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it can't be true.
Thank you, Libby. And now, this is a time in our service where we share our joys and sorrows. I thank you again for allowing me to start the service with a joy and a sorrow that I personally had. But I invite you now to come forward if you'd like to share something with this fellowship. As I said earlier, that's what we're all about, is that connection and that opportunity to sort of let it be for everyone to experience. So would anybody like to come forward? Come on, Nancy.
Some of you have already noticed that Bill isn't here today. He's at home recovering from pneumonia. But I also, along with you, have a granddaughter. She has a daughter. I have a granddaughter living in LA. The fires are getting closer to her, but she is still not in an evacuation area. She's packed and ready to go if she needs to. It's very hard for me to not ask, do you have things ready for the cats? Do you have all their food? Do you have your medicine? But I have restrained myself.
I set the checklist. I know we all want to hold those that are family and friends that are in this area in our hearts, but especially even those that we don't know. It's so important that they know that, we're thinking about them. And of course, there are plenty of places that you can do something tangible to support if you so desire. Anyone else?
Hi, Melanie, and I'm so happy to be here. It's such a comfort just to be in the fellowship right now. I was just thinking, this is not really, it's a sad joy in a way, I guess, not really joy totally, but I was thinking my mother-in-law I never got to meet. Sadly, she died when she was 21 of some kind of, sadly, meningitis of the brain, but she would be 80 on Wednesday, so I'm just thinking of her and everyone else who's maybe had that long of a loss. But the positive part is I feel she does live through her surviving sister who we've kept in touch with and my spouse. So, thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, those around us are part of our story, right? And we of theirs. Anyone else? Well, whether or not you chose to share today, for your joys, feel our celebration. For your sorrows, feel our compassion and sympathy. And I'm going to invite, because I liked doing that, Libby to come up and sing with me, Spirit of Life. We do. We have Avi. Okay, so Avi will lead us in Spirit of Life.
Please join me in singing number hymn 123, Spirit of Life. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea. Move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
So even when you put the scripts together, you can forget when they're not traditional, how they flow. But this part is one of my favorites. It's a time, call it time of prayer, time of meditation, but I have a reading that I'd like to go through as we close down this service. So get yourself comfortable, maybe your feet on your floor, hands in your lap, eyes closed, head bowed, whatever makes you comfortable. But listen to the words of the Reverend Scott Taylor. Who dreamed you into being? What stories set in their heart as they imagined what you would become? Who helped you imagine your story? Who helped you see your place in the story of the world. And what maybe matters the most, who helped you understand that you could be the author of your own unfolding? All of which is to say, who listened? Who listened until you could hear yourself speak, until you trusted the voice that is your own? And now that you know what it is like to have the tale of yourself be heard into being, how might you midwife the story of another into existence? You know the kind of stories I'm talking about, those kept in cramped spaces of silence for fear of how hard and narrow this world of ours can be. Who needs your listening so their story can be set free? Whose story needs held in your heart so it knows it is worth entering into the world? We say it is about listening, but really it's about love. It is through affection that our stories are born. They are wooed into this world. Never forget that, nor this. It is through loving the stories of others and the stories of our own that we discover they love us back. So be it. Amen. Now, I invite you to rise in spirit or physically rise for a closing song that Avi has recorded for us. And the words are on the sheet printed on your seat. So it is hymn 311, Let It Be a Dance. Let's sing together as we wind down the service.
Please join me in our closing hymn, number 311, Let It Be a Dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Let a dancing song be heard. Play the music, say the words, and fill the sky with sailing birds. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Learn to follow, learn to lead. Feel the rhythm, feel the need. To reap the harvest, plant the seed. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Everybody turn and spin. Let your body learn to bend. And like a willow with the wind, let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. A child is born, the old will die. A time for joy, a time to cry. Take it as it passes by. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. The morning star comes out at night. Without the dark there is no light. If nothing's wrong then nothing's right. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let the sunshine, let it rain. Share the laughter, bear the pain. And round we go again. Let it be a dance. 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 Let it be a dance.
May the stories we tell name the largest truths of what was, of what is, and pull us forward to what should be, as stories were always meant to. That concludes our service. For those of you who joined us on Zoom, we thank you for being with us here today. We hope you join us again next week. I know we'll all enjoy congratulating Reverend Libby on a wonderful sermon message, and I'm hopeful you'll stick around with us for a chat about some of the themes that you left with us today. For everyone who's here, join us in the cafeteria for coffee and fellowship and conversation. Go now in peace.
Nicely done, as always, Karen.
Right, not feeling my best.
What?
Not feeling my best, but
Yeah, sorry.
yeah, that's all right.
It makes it hard to focus.
It does.
When you're in pain.
And I also changed contact lenses, and I was trying to get the distance vision going, and I can't really get. I'm gonna have to do readers or something,
Right.
just to
I
be able to
gave-
follow the words.
When I got to that point,